This was his idea to save Jews. Whether it's a woman, child, an old man, young man, whomever. This was his idea.
It was 1940. The world was already 2 years into the most devastating war it had ever known. In the dense, shadowed forests of Belarus, a group of brothers stood at the edge of an uncertain future. Tuvia, Asael, and Bielski had just witnessed the destruction of their world. Their parents had been murdered, their Jewish community had been decimated by the Germans, and the looming terror of being hunted like animals was very real. But what the Germans could never have expected was that these brothers, driven by loss and fury, would become some of the most daring and successful resistors of the Holocaust. How does a family, broken by unimaginable grief, rise from the ashes to defy one of the most brutal regimes in history? And how would these three men, who were once simple farmers, become saviors to over 1,200 Jews? The Bielski brothers fled into the Naliboki forest. It was a place they had known well as children, a place of refuge, but now it would become something far more dangerous and complicated. The forest was vast, but it was no sanctuary. It was filled with German patrols and local collaborators eager to turn in any Jew they found for a reward. Every moment was a gamble with the end, but for the Bielskis, it was the only chance they had to fight back, to resist being mere victims of the German extermination plan. As the days turned into weeks, something extraordinary began to happen. Word of the Bielski brothers spread among the Jewish communities of the region. More and more Jews began to flee the ghettos, risking everything to escape the Germans. They had heard that in the forest, the Bielski brothers were forming a resistance, a place where Jews could hide and survive. It started with just a few stragglers joining the brothers, but soon, dozens and then hundreds arrived at their hidden camp, desperately seeking safety. But how does one protect so many people in the heart of enemy territory? Could these three brothers really keep them all safe? Or was it only a matter of time before the Gestapo discovered them? Tuvia Bielski, the eldest brother, was the heart of the operation. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the survival of his people. He made it clear to his brothers and all who came to the camp that they would prioritize life over revenge. "I would rather save one Jewish life than kill 10 Germans," he often said. His goal was not to become a warrior, but to save as many lives as possible. And so, the Bielski camp wasn't just for fighters. It was a refuge for women, children, the elderly, and anyone who could make it to the forest. But with each new person that arrived, the risk grew. The camp's size made it harder to stay hidden, and food became scarce. Could the Bielski brothers hold everything together, or was their sanctuary doomed to collapse under the pressure? As the harsh winter of 1942 approached, the challenges of survival intensified. Food was scarce, the cold was unbearable, and the constant threat of discovery weighed on everyone. The Germans knew that Jews were hiding in the forests and began launching sweeps through the area. The brothers knew they were being hunted. Every crack of a twig, every shadow in the trees could mean that their camp had been discovered. Despite the fear, the Bielski brothers led with unwavering determination. They built underground bunkers to hide their people, organized food raids, and formed alliances with local partisans fighting against the Germans. The forest, once a place of isolation, became their fortress. They set up workshops to repair weapons, and even a school to teach the children. In the midst of war, they created a community built on survival and hope. But how long could they keep it going? The Germans were relentless, and each day the risk of betrayal or discovery grew. Could the brothers outsmart the enemy, or would they be forced to make an impossible choice, fight or flee? As time passed, the Bielski camp became one of the largest and most successful rescue operations of World War II. Over 1,200 Jews found safety there. It was an extraordinary feat of courage and leadership, but it was not without its tensions. Tuvia's belief in saving lives above all else often clashed with his brother Zeus, who was driven by a fierce desire to fight and strike back at the Gestapo. While Tuvia focused on protecting the group, Zeus wanted to lead more attacks against the Germans. This difference in philosophy created friction between the brothers. There were heated arguments, moments where it seemed their unity might fracture under the weight of their differing goals. But despite their conflicts, they remained committed to the larger mission, to save as many Jews as possible and to resist the German machine. As tensions mounted and German forces closed in, would the brothers be able to stay united in their fight? Or would their differences tear apart everything they had built? The turning point came when the Germans intensified their efforts to wipe out any resistance in the forests. They sent in more troops, more collaborators, and the search for hidden Jews became even more ruthless. The brothers knew that their time in the forest was running out. The closer the Germans came, the more dangerous every decision became. Tuvia had to weigh the lives of his people against the ever-growing threat, and yet, the Bielski camp continued to thrive. They launched daring raids on German supply lines, stole weapons, and brought in more refugees. Their courage was infectious, and those who were once terrified learned to fight, to believe in the possibility of survival. But survival was not without sacrifice. There were heartbreaking losses, close calls that nearly exposed their entire operation, and moments where the fate of the entire camp rested on a single perilous decision. Could the Bielski brothers maintain their courage and strength, or would the relentless pursuit of the Germans finally break them? How many lives could they save before the enemy closed in? As the war raged on, the Bielski brothers' camp in the heart of the forest became a symbol of defiance, of hope against all odds. But for every victory, there was heartbreak. Families reunited after escaping the ghettos, only to find that their loved ones had been killed or captured. Mothers clung to their children, whispering stories of survival, trying to shield them from the horrors that surrounded them. There were nights when the cries of the children pierced the silence of the forest, a reminder that this was not just a fight for survival, but a fight for the future, a fight to hold on to the very essence of life in a world consumed by destruction. How do you keep hope alive when the world around you is crumbling? How do you lead people through the darkest moments when every day could be your last? Tuvia Bielski, ever the leader, bore the weight of these questions every day. His decisions weren't just about tactics or strategy, they were about saving lives. There were times when the weight of responsibility seemed unbearable. The fear of making the wrong decision, of leading his people into a trap, haunted him. And yet, he never let that fear show. His strength became their strength. His hope became their hope. One cold, bitter night, when supplies were dangerously low, Tuvia gathered his people together. The firelight flickered against their tired faces, the fear and uncertainty palpable in the air. "We are not just surviving," Tuvia told them, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We are living. Every day we stay alive is a victory against the Germans. Every person we save is a blow to their cruelty. We will not give them the satisfaction of breaking us." But could words alone be enough to keep them going? Could courage and unity truly stand against the might of the German war machine? The people believed in Tuvia, but the harsh reality of the forest made it difficult to hold on to hope. There were days when hunger gnawed at their bellies, when illness spread through the camp, and when the sounds of German patrols grew closer, making their hearts race with terror. And then there were the betrayals, the constant threat that one of their own, out of desperation or fear, might lead the Germans to their doorstep. There was a night, one of the darkest nights, when Tuvia's worst fear nearly came true. A young man, caught by German collaborators while trying to gather food, was forced to reveal the location of the camp. The Bielski brothers received word of the betrayal just in time. With no time to waste, Tuvia rallied the group, moving everyone, hundreds of men, women, and children, deeper into the forest, covering their tracks as they went. It was a race against time, and the fear that hung over them was suffocating. The group marched in silence, children clutched tightly to their mothers, older men helping the weaker ones along. Every sound, every snap of a twig, felt like it might be their last. The Bielski brothers led the way, their eyes scanning the dark woods for any sign of the enemy. Would this be the moment the Germans finally caught them? How many more close calls could they endure before their luck ran out? Miraculously, they escaped. The Gestapo, relentless as they were, never found the new camp, but the close call shook everyone. The reality of their fragile existence hit hard. The forest had been their sanctuary, but it was also a constant reminder of the thin line between life and loss. And yet, even in the face of this terror, they persisted. Tuvia refused to let them fall into despair. He knew that if they lost hope, they would lose everything. It wasn't just the brothers who showed courage. The women of the camp were its lifeblood. They tended to the sick, rationed the little food they had, and supported their husbands, brothers, and sons on the front lines of the resistance. Women like Bielski, Tuvia's wife, who despite the unimaginable horrors, never stopped believing that they would make it through the war. She embodied the quiet strength that so many women carried during these dark times, a resilience that kept the camp together even when the odds seemed impossible. But as the group grew, so did the tension. Food was harder to find, and the more people they sheltered, the more dangerous it became. The Gestapo were increasing their sweeps of the forests, and each time they heard the rumble of German trucks or the shout of soldiers in the distance, panic would ripple through the camp. And then came the hardest decision of all. Tuvia, faced with the reality that they couldn't stay hidden forever, began to consider the unthinkable, launching a full-scale attack on a German outpost. It was a desperate plan, one that could either save them by crippling the German patrols or lead to their annihilation. Zeus, always the fighter, pushed for it. "If we don't hit them, they'll hit us first," he argued. Tuvia knew the risks. He knew that leading his people into battle could mean the end of the Bielski camp as they knew it. But he also knew that doing nothing meant perishing by 1,000 cuts, starvation, illness, or eventual discovery by the Gestapo. Could they really take on the Gestapo and win? Or was this the final, desperate gamble of a group with nothing left to lose? They made their plans, knowing full well that it could be the last decision they ever made. As the group prepared for the raid, there was a solemnity in the air. Everyone understood the stakes. The children were hidden deep in the forest, guarded by a few trusted men, while the rest of the fighters prepared for battle. On the night of the attack, the Bielski brothers and their fighters moved like shadows through the forest. The silence was deafening, the tension unbearable. Hearts pounded in their chests, the fear palpable but mixed with determination. This was their chance to strike back, to prove that they were not just victims, they were resistors. When the fighting began, it was chaos. Gunfire lit up the night, and the Bielski fighters, armed with little more than courage and a few stolen weapons, took on the German soldiers with everything they had. The battle was fierce, but against all odds, the Bielskis triumphed. The German outpost was destroyed, and they returned to their camp victorious. But the victory came at a cost. They lost some of their bravest fighters that night, and the weight of those losses hung heavy over the camp. And yet, they had proven something to themselves and to the world. They were not just survivors, they were fighters, and they would not be erased from history. The night after the attack on the German outpost, the camp was eerily quiet. There was no celebration, no relief, just the heavy weight of exhaustion and grief. The victory had come at a price, and the survivors now had to reckon with the faces they would never see again. Mothers wept silently over the empty spaces where their sons once sat, and the air was thick with the kind of sorrow that comes only from losing loved ones too soon. Tuvia Bielski stood apart from the others, his face a mask of calm, though his heart was in turmoil. Every decision he made, every step he took, weighed on him like a stone. How much longer could he ask his people to endure this life of constant fear? How much longer could they keep outwitting the Gestapo? That night, as Tuvia stared into the flickering fire, his mind was filled with doubt. Was he leading his people to safety, or was he merely delaying the inevitable? The weight of leadership had never felt so heavy. He knew that every life in the camp rested on his shoulders, and the responsibility was overwhelming. He was tired, so tired. But there was no rest in the forest, no respite from the relentless pursuit of survival. Would he make the right choices, or was he leading them all into the jaws of destruction? The morning after the battle, the group mourned its losses, but there was no time to dwell. The Gestapo wouldn't forget the attack, and they would be back, angrier and more determined than ever. The tension in the camp was palpable. Every person there knew that they were living on borrowed time, that their sanctuary in the forest could be discovered at any moment. The fear was ever present, like a storm cloud hanging over their heads, threatening to break at any second. How do you keep hope alive when the enemy is always at your door? How do you find strength when every day feels like it could be your last? Tuvia and his brothers worked tirelessly, always one step ahead of the Gestapo. They moved the camp frequently, leaving behind carefully concealed traps and misleading tracks to confuse the Germans. But with over 1,200 people, moving became more difficult, and hiding became almost impossible. Every time they relocated, there were whispers of doubt among the people. How long could they keep this up? The winter of 1943 was brutal. The forest that had once offered protection now turned on them as the cold seeped into their bones and the hunger gnawed at their bellies. Food was scarce and supplies were running low. The trees, once their protectors, now seemed like prison walls, trapping them in a never-ending fight for survival. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Tuvia sat with Chaja, his wife. She had always been his anchor, the quiet strength behind his leadership, but even she was beginning to show signs of wear. The lines on her face were deeper now, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed by the weight of their shared struggle. "How long can we keep going, Tuvia?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How long before they find us?" Tuvia didn't have an answer. All he could do was hold her hand, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. He was supposed to be the strong one, the leader, but in that moment, he felt more like a man grasping at straws, trying to hold everything together with his bare hands. He had no idea how long they could keep going, how long they could keep outsmarting the Gestapo. What happens when even the leaders begin to lose hope? Can they keep going when every path seems to lead to destruction? As the weeks wore on, the tension in the camp escalated. Food shortages caused tempers to flare. Parents struggled to keep their children quiet, fearing that even the slightest noise could give away their position. Every cough, every rustle of leaves sent a shiver of terror through the camp. It was like living on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath their feet. Then came the news they had been dreading. A local collaborator, someone who had once been part of the resistance, had turned traitor and led the Gestapo to the area where the Bielski camp was hidden. The betrayal was like a knife to the heart, slicing through the fragile thread of safety they had so carefully woven. The Gestapo were coming, and this time they were coming in force. The Bielski brothers didn't hesitate. They knew they had only hours, maybe less, to move the entire camp, over 1,200 people, through the dense forest without being seen, heard, or tracked. It was an impossible task, but Tuvia refused to consider failure. Failure meant destruction. It meant the end of everything they had fought for. The camp was in chaos. Families hastily packed up what little belongings they had. Children were hurriedly silenced, fear etched into their young faces. There was no time for careful planning, no time for hesitation. They had to move, and they had to move fast. The sound of distant engines rumbled through the trees, a terrifying reminder that the Gestapo were closing in. Could they escape in time? Or was this the moment their luck would finally run out? The march through the forest that night was like something out of a nightmare. The group moved in total silence, the only sounds the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional muffled sob of a child. Fear hung thick in the air, pressing down on them, making every breath feel heavy like they were suffocating. The darkness was both their shield and their enemy, hiding them from German patrols but making every step a treacherous gamble. A single misstep, a single cry, could bring the Germans down upon them. Tuvia led from the front, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the trees for any sign of danger. Every second felt like a lifetime, the weight of responsibility crushing him. He knew that if they were caught, it would be his fault. It would be his failure. But he couldn't let that happen. He had led them this far. He had to get them through this. Failure wasn't an option. The group moved through the forest in absolute silence, but the tension was suffocating. Every step was filled with the fear that one wrong move, one noise, would alert the German patrols sweeping through the area. The weight of fear pressed down on them, turning the frigid air into something thick and unbearable. Mothers clutched their children to their chests, stifling their cries, and fathers walked with grim faces, eyes darting toward every shadow that seemed to flicker in the moonlight. Tuvia Bielski, at the front of the group, led them through the winding trails, always alert, always listening for the distant rumble of engines or the heavy boots of the German soldiers. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. What if they couldn't move fast enough? What if the Gestapo were already too close? What if this was the end? But he had no time for doubt. He had to keep going. He had to keep his people alive. The snow crunched softly underfoot, and every sound felt like a betrayal, echoing in the eerie stillness of the forest. The cold bit at their skin, seeping into their bones, but it was nothing compared to the icy terror coursing through their veins. The entire camp, hundreds of men, women, and children, moved like shadows, their footsteps deliberate, slow, yet tinged with desperation. They knew that behind them, not far away, the Gestapo were closing in. How much longer could they outrun the enemy? As the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to take its toll. Children too tired to walk were carried by their parents, their tiny faces pale with fear and cold. The older members of the camp struggled to keep up, their bodies weak from months of hunger and hiding, yet they pressed on, driven by the will to survive. They had no choice but to keep moving. Suddenly, in the distance, a faint rumble cut through the cold night air, the unmistakable sound of German vehicles. The group froze, their hearts hammering in their chests. The sound was getting louder, closer. The Gestapo were near. Panic spread like wildfire through the camp, but Tuvia, with his calm and commanding presence, turned to face his people. His voice, barely more than a whisper, was steady and filled with urgency. "Stay low, stay quiet. We move quickly, but we do not run." His words were firm, but the fear in his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. They were running out of time. The group followed him deeper into the woods, weaving through the trees, hearts racing, eyes wide with terror. Every snap of a branch felt like the end. Every whisper of wind felt like the approach of demise. Tuvia's eyes darted between the trees, searching for a place where they could hide, where they could escape the inevitable. Finally, they came upon a narrow ravine, its steep sides hidden beneath the thick foliage. It was their only chance. Without hesitation, Tuvia motioned for his people to follow him, and they slid down the incline, one by one, sinking into the shadows. The ravine was shallow, barely enough to conceal the entire group, but it was better than nothing. They pressed themselves against the cold earth, every breath held, as the sound of German trucks grew louder, the engines roaring like thunder in the stillness of the night. Would the Gestapo find them now, so close to safety? Could they possibly stay hidden in such a vulnerable position? As the trucks passed overhead, the group lay completely still, the air so thick with fear it was almost suffocating. Tuvia didn't dare move. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, each beat a painful reminder of how close they were to being discovered. The sound of German voices carried through the trees, their harsh words piercing the silence. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. The people in the ravine were so close to the enemy that they could hear the snap of twigs under their boots, feel the vibration of their steps in the frozen ground. One of the children let out a soft whimper, barely audible, but to Tuvia, it was deafening. He felt his heart stop, his breath catch in his throat. The Gestapo paused, their voices lowering as if they had heard something. The air froze. It felt as though time itself stopped. The entire camp held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable. A shout, a flashlight, the crack of a rifle. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers moved on. The trucks rumbled away, the sound of engines fading into the distance. They had survived. This time. How many more close calls could they endure before their luck finally ran out? Would the forest continue to protect them, or was it just delaying the inevitable? When the sound of the trucks disappeared entirely, the camp slowly began to stir. People dared to breathe again, dared to move. Mothers hugged their children tightly, relief washing over them like a flood, but there was no time for rest. Tuvia urged them forward. They had survived this close call, but they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The Gestapo would continue their search, and next time, they might not be so lucky. As they moved through the forest, Tuvia's mind was a storm of emotions. He had led them to safety once again, but how much longer could they keep this up? How many more times could they dodge the inevitable? He was proud of the courage his people showed, proud of how they had fought to survive in the face of such overwhelming odds. But the burden of responsibility weighed heavier on him with each passing day. That night, as the group finally stopped to rest, Tuvia stood on the outskirts of the camp, watching over them. His heart ached for the people he had lost along the way, for the ones who hadn't made it through the raids or the long, grueling nights of marching through the freezing forest. The grief was a constant companion, gnawing at him, but he couldn't let it break him. Not yet. He had to stay strong for them, for all of them. But how long can a man carry the weight of so many lives before it becomes too much? How long before the strength that has kept them alive begins to wane? As the rumble of German trucks faded, the Bielski camp stirred, but fear still gripped them. They had survived another close call, but every step through the forest felt heavier. Tuvia Bielski, standing watch, bore the crushing weight of leadership. How much longer could he keep his people safe? The forest, once their sanctuary, was now a trap tightening around them. The cold bit at their bones as the group moved silently deeper into the trees. Every snap of a branch echoed like a warning. The children were exhausted, the elders weaker by the day, but there was no room for rest. They had to keep moving. If they stopped, they'd be caught. The Bielski brothers knew the inevitable was closing in. The Gestapo were relentless, and each passing day felt like a final countdown. But just as hope seemed to fade, news came. The Soviet army was advancing. Liberation was near. In the summer of 1944, after years of hiding and fighting, the Bielski camp was freed. Over 1,200 Jews, saved by the brothers' courage, emerged from the forest, tired, scarred, but alive. Tuvia had kept his promise. He had led them to survival. The war ended, but the legacy of the Bielski brothers lived on. They had defied the Gestapo, saved lives, and proven that even in the darkest times, hope can prevail. They stood as symbols of resilience, courage, and the will to fight for life no matter the cost. And in the end, they won.